So we are wired for story. We make sense of the world through the stories that we tell. I think that that's one of the most lovely things about reading and wrestling with the Bible is that it is a collection of engaging and challenging and even odd and confusing and horrible stories written over a long period of time by people in different contexts who are experiencing different struggles, who are experiencing different joys, and all making sense of it through the stories they tell. The stories that we tell are shaped by the experiences we have had, the culture within which we grew up and that we live in kind of a chicken versus egg kind of way. Our stories shape our experience, and our experiences shape our stories. Last week, I had the opportunity to attend the annual clergy retreat for the ABCMC region. And this was just so wonderful. It was wonderful to get to meet more of the clergy that are part of our region and to build relationships and get to talk with people and learn about their ministries in the small group breakout sessions that we had and during lunchtime and fellowship time. It was a really wonderful experience. We are connected to some very amazing people. That was the big take-home message from the week. But while building relationships was a major part of the purpose for this clergy retreat, the continuing ed opportunity that we did was really engaging as well. We focused our time on the Pearson-Marr Archetype Indicator, or PMAI, which is something that's associated with Myers-Briggs, and it's another personality kind of thing, but this one is all about the stories that we tell and the ways that we use these stories to make sense of ourselves and our world. So imagine, if you will, that your unconscious is acting kind of like a casting director. So as you move through your day and through your journey, this unconscious casting director is just choosing for you, without you even really thinking about it, which parts of your story and you are relevant and at the time, and which parts are not. Or the pieces of your story, the things that happen, which parts are meaningful and which parts don't catch the attention of the casting director. The Pearson-Marr Archetype Indicator focuses on 12 archetypes, which are storylines. They are kind of structures or frameworks that we use to frame our experience. These 12 archetypes kind of work like this inner casting director. The 12 types include the innocent, the orphan, the warrior, the caregiver, the seeker, the lover, the destroyer, the creator, the ruler, the magician, the sage, and the jester. Each of these stories are really interesting, and throughout our lives, at different times and in different contexts, we find ourselves living out one or more of these storylines. The theory behind this is that the more we understand about our journey, the more that we are able to kind of partner with that unconscious storytelling that's happening so that we can start to make some conscious choices and share in the process of storytelling. So the goal really is to understand more consciously how our stories shape us, and then how we have access to different types of stories that maybe we hadn't considered before, but maybe these stories might be the ones that hold gifts that help us move into a new space or overcome a challenge, that might help us to build or repair a relationship, and that might especially help us to increase our understanding and our empathy for the stories of others. Stories are how we understand our world. And so this theme of stories has been churning around inside of me all week, but I was struggling to discern a direction. What scripture was I going to choose? I don't know. There's so many different ways to go. And then the scripture from Romans 12 came to me from multiple directions this week. I have to tell you that Romans is definitely not my go-to place. Many of the words of Paul are really challenging because they have a lot of baggage. A lot of these words have been weaponized. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Not all that long ago, I have heard someone use these words as an effort to fight against inclusion. So when desiring a church that is open and affirming, I've heard words that said, don't conform to the world. So as you can imagine, I wasn't particularly drawn to these words, but they kept coming at me. So many of Paul's words are a struggle because they've been used to justify things that I just don't want to be a part of. They've been used to justify keeping women from leadership in the church, and they've been even used to justify slavery as biblical. So it's a challenge. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. So these words kept coming back to me this week, and one of the places that these words arrived were in a daily email devotional. Richard Rohr wrote this, writing about privilege this week. The system benefiting me was never intended to benefit all. And because the system benefits me, I don't need to see it clearly. On the other hand, those who do not receive its benefits are required to see it for their very survival. Thus, God calls us to not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds through relationship with those who see life from a different perspective than we do. That is a different way of looking at that. My mind was just blown by this. I'd been so resistant to these words that kept coming after me. Because somebody else had told a different story, I had a hard time seeing this whole other story that I had access to. And that devotion was such a gift. As a collective, as a group, as congregations, as organizations, as political parties, even as a nation, we live out archetypes. We live out these stories, and these stories often operate under the surface. They move in ways that we are not even cognizant of. They almost move on autopilot. Systems and structures and institutions provide us with storylines that we operate in without even realizing that we are. This is why when we hear people say that we are post-racial, when we are clearly not, this is why. These stories operate, and from our privilege, they can operate where we don't see them. So if we're truly not going to allow ourselves to be conformed to the patterns of this world, we are going to have to do some really hard work to discern what those patterns even are in the first place. If we're going to need to engage another story. And we're going to have to actively seek out other stories, other perspectives, hearing other stories that can help us better understand our own. And that's a gift. And in that gift, it can also be incredibly painful because sometimes when we hear the story of another, it helps us to see the pain that we have caused without even being aware. So a couple of weeks ago, we considered our playlist and how the psalmist sung about the power of a new song. And just like singing a new song can change everything, telling a new story can be transformational. Sometimes in telling a new story, we need to be intentional to listen to stories other than our own, to engage stories from a different perspective that helps us to realize that a story isn't the story. Throughout the ministry of Jesus, we continually see him showing us that the dominant narrative isn't the story, no matter how badly the empire wants us to see it that way. Jesus seems to turn the story on its head and offer us an alternative. When the children started coming towards Jesus and the disciples were getting really frustrated because they thought these kids are annoying and they are getting in the way of the really important work that we are doing here, Jesus said, "No, let them come to me. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What could be more important? There's example after example of a new story. The woman at the well, the tax collectors and the sinners that Jesus had the audacity to eat with and to call his friends and to invite, "Follow me." The world, the powers that be, had a narrative for these people, but Jesus knew a completely different story. History is written by the victors, right? The winners, those who come out with power, which is something also that makes reading the Bible so unique, because really, this is a collection of stories from the underdogs. This is a relatively little tribe of people who were enslaved, dominated, and oppressed for most of the story by whoever was the powerful neighbor at the time. The Gospels declare Jesus the Messiah, and he was crucified for his refusal of the dominant narrative of empire. Jesus refused to be conformed to the patterns of the world. The good news of the gospel is that the last are first, the weak are strong, and this tells us something really important about perspective. There's a reason that liberation theology, which views the stories in the Bible from the vantage of freeing people from religious, political, social, and economic oppression, did not originate and has not largely been embraced by Western Christianity. This isn't the narrative. Ever since Christianity was embraced by the Roman Empire, the dominant interpretive perspective has not been from the margins. It hasn't been from the powerless or the poor, but it's been from the victors, from the powerful, and the ones in charge. And this is a very different story. Last week, when I was looking for something completely different, I stumbled across a really wonderful TED Talk by the novelist Chimamanda Adichie called "The Danger of a Single Story." Maybe some of you have seen it. I added a link into the Bible app, so if you're curious, it really is wonderful. But as she's talking, she talks about how our lives and our cultures are made up of these intersecting and overlapping stories. Adichie grew up in a middle-class family in Nigeria. And like many middle-class families, they had domestic help from a nearby rural village. A boy named Fide worked for them. Her mother would send home food and would send home their clothing that they had outgrown with Fide. Her mother told her that Fide's family was very, very poor. When Adichie didn't want to finish her dinner one night, her mother would say to her, "Finish your food. People like Fide's family have nothing." And then one day, she visited Fide's family. And when she visited his family, Fide's mother showed her this beautiful basket that Fide's brother had made. She marveled at the basket, the craftsmanship, the beauty. She had never thought that someone from Fide's poor family could make something. She had only thought of them as poor. She had a single story. But then she moved to the US, and she found herself on the other end of the single story. Her American roommate was shocked that she could speak English so well, completely unaware that the official language in Nigeria is English. Her roommate was really excited to hear some of her new roommate's tribal music, only to be incredibly disappointed when she pulled out a tape of Mariah Carey. A single story was what this roommate had. She didn't know this complex, multidimensional, beautiful reality. Adiche's talk shined a light on the risk of misunderstanding that happens when we operate from a single story about another, from a circumstance or a background that is not like our own. Whether it be interpreting the Bible or understanding our culture and context or our moment in time, we benefit by hearing and engaging a new story. Sometimes, by embracing a new hopeful story over a life limiting story, we can find transformation. All throughout Epiphany, we've been asking the question, where is the light? And I think that there is light to be found in our stories. And there is light to be found in the stories that are not like our own. Sometimes the brightest light is found in bearing witness to the darkest of stories and seeing that light of resilience that cannot be overcome. So I wonder, have you had an experience of a new perspective changing the way that you understand your own story? Have you ever been shocked to discover that you were operating from a single story that allowed you to completely misunderstand someone or something? Or perhaps you've been the victim of a single story. Have you ever consciously engaged a new narrative to transform your reality? So, where do you find yourself in the story this morning? Welcome to the conversation.